this little project going where I'm taking this bike across the different geographic areas of the state of Texas and bringing you along with, telling you a little bit about the different areas that I'm in, and being a two-wheel tour guide to places that you may not have seen yet, or you may never see. Usually I'll tell you a little bit about what you're seeing, then I'll tell a story or two. That is exactly what I came out here intending to do, but my mind's just weighing on me. I can't do it. The story I'm going to tell is the most horrific, terrible guy story I've ever heard. And quite frankly, just in tribute to the poor soul that this happened to, I think this story deserves its own video. And maybe in about 10 minutes when we're done, you'll agree. Now, I'm from the city. I didn't grow up with horses or cows, but this is Texas. There are a lot of horses and cows around, even inside the city. There are pieces of land that have horses and cows, and occasionally horses or cows, they would get loose. They would start causing havoc. And I had a job about 15 years ago that wasn't dealing with horses and cows directly, but occasionally if you had some loose livestock that got out and was causing problems, I had to go try and get it contained so we could get it back to its owner. And we had a full-time person who did that, but when he wasn't there, the responsibility for getting that thing contained so we could get it back to its owner would fall on whoever was there, which more than once turned out to be me. Now, I don't know anything about horses, so you tell me there is a loose horse causing problems and we need to get it contained and get it back to its owner. How do you do that? Well, if you're like me and you're from the city, I'll tell you how you do it. The first thing you have to do is you have to get it contained in fenced in area, some area that the horse can't just run away from. Then you can call or have brought to you a livestock truck. And on the sides of the livestock trailer, there are sections of fence that connect together on the ends, and you form them into a loose circle. And then if you can get the horse or the cow to get inside that, you can close it off into a little corral, and little by little start taking sections of fence away until it gets closer and closer to the trailer, and eventually you've just got a couple of sections of fence and the horse or cow at the door of the trailer. And if they won't go in, there's something called a hot shot or a cattle prod. It's about a 3-foot long piece of fiberglass. It's got 2 prongs on one end, a battery pack on the other. And if you juice it with that 50,000 volts, it'll usually jump up in that trailer pretty quick. Although I was warned with good reason not to stand directly behind a horse or a cow if you're going to hit it with a hot shot, because it'll kick faster than you can get out of the way. And I was working one time trying to get some horse or some cow up into a trailer one time, and it was hot and it would not get contained, and it was just stressing the hell out of me. And we had a full-time livestock guy who showed up, and I was complaining to him about how this animal, whatever it was, we could not get it contained, could not get it in a little corral area. We'd been there for 2 hours trying to get it hooked up, and he nodded his head, went back to the cab of the truck, got a plastic bucket out, went and put some pebbles in the bucket, started rattling it, and I guess the horse thought that was a bucket of feed and trotted right up into the trailer. So our full-time livestock guy, he did not make any friends with us that day. We were not happy that he was able to get done in about 60 seconds what had taken us 2 hours and 5 years of our life trying to get accomplished. Now, at some point in time, he got in a wreck, and some period of time after that, I was asking him about the wreck, and he was not happy to talk about it. And I'm going to tell you right now, I may get some of the small details wrong, but the core issues that makes this story so terrible, I am 100% dead on, because it was that memorable. He had a pickup truck, which was a dually. He had a goose bed trailer, which was a long livestock trailer, so it had a horse and maybe several cows in it. And so it was heavy. And he was driving along in the Dallas area. He came up over a rise, and traffic ahead of him on the interstate had stopped. So he did what anybody does when you see traffic ahead stop. He reached over with his foot, pressed the brake. The truck started slowing down, but it took him about a half a second to realize that even though it was slowing down, it was not slowing down in time. He realized that he was going to run directly into the vehicle in front of him with this truck and this trailer with these animals in it. And for some some reason, he was either blocked in, it was a construction site. For some reason, he couldn't swerve left or right. He was going to go straight ahead into the vehicle in front of him, and he knew that there was nothing he could do to stop it because he was pumping the brakes. The brakes were not working. And unfortunately for him, the vehicle in front of him was an 18-wheeler, and it had a trailer on the back, and he was headed right into the back of that trailer. Now, he had seen crashes of vehicles into the back of trailers before, and he knew how bad they could be because the height of the trailer is just high enough that a car can go right up underneath it, and it will decapitate whoever is in the car. And in fact, there's a bar. I think a movie star hit the back of a trailer one time, so there's a bar on the back that's named after that movie star. I can't recall what it is, to stop vehicles from going up underneath the back of trailers. But be that as it may, he's pushing the brakes. He knows he's going to hit. He knows there's nothing he can do. He knows that this cab or the back of the trailer can decapitate him if he hits it. And so when he realizes that he's a split second away from impact, he realizes there's nothing he could do. He threw himself down horizontally on the bench seat of the cab, and the truck did go right up underneath the backside of that trailer. In fact, it clipped the cab off of the truck. It turned out that him throwing himself down across the seat saved his life, because when the truck went up underneath the back of that trailer and clipped the cab off, everybody who was watching just assumed he was dead. They could not believe that he would have survived, and he wouldn't have had he not thrown himself down at the very last fraction of a second. And so bystanders came up, and they were expecting the very worst, and they heard him growling and screaming, and then they were shocked to find out that he was still alive in there. And once you know that you've got somebody who's alive, who's crunched up underneath the back of an 18-wheeler, it became a race to try and get him out. So the firemen show up. Apparently they can't believe that anybody survived that either. They hear him screaming. They break out the jaws. They start trying to cut this mangled piece of what used to be a truck loose to get him out. And they're working on the jaws. They're telling him to hold on. And then all of a sudden he would start screaming to high heaven. And that would make them work that much harder, because they could tell by the agony in his voice that he was dying on them. And when they could hear that agony, that made them work that much harder. And so they kept going and kept going, kept cutting. There was a fireman out there that was telling him, "Hang on, buddy, we're coming for you, don't give up." He said he could hear somebody outside praying, because they too heard the agony in his voice. They too heard that he was dying. And he kept waiting and waiting to get free of that cab, and it was not happening. He was wrapped up so tight in that mangled remains of that truck that he was like a mummy surrounded by steel. He could not move. He could move his finger a little bit. He could move his leg a little bit, but other than that, he was pinned into place. And this went on for a long time. It was 20, 30, 40 minutes. It was a long time. He said he had time to think about how if this truck bursts into flames, he is in big trouble. He had time to, I guess, get right with God. And he wanted to get right with God because this was a terrible, terrible thing he was going through. He was wrapped up so tight in that cab, and he desperately tried to move. He used every bit of strength in his body to try and shift position, to try and move his leg, to try and move something other than his hand, but he was wrapped up so tight he could not do it. He could hear the jaws of life cutting away metal. He kept hoping that they would come faster. They could hear him scream to high heaven. They could hear the pain and agony in his voice. And it was an actual first responder race against time, with these firemen doing everything they can to get to him before clearly he was going to die. And time was just slowing down. There was just no easy way to get to him. And like I said, after 20, 30, 40 minutes of this, finally they cut him free. They cut the truck free, at least of the back end of the 18-wheeler trailer. They were able to get the metal away from him enough to where it wouldn't endanger him when I guess they put a sling on the back of what was left of his truck and pulled it loose to get him out. And as soon as they pulled him, or the truck loose, he sprung up out of what had been his mangled metal coffin, sprung up like a jack-in-the-box, tears in his eyes, face white as a ghost, chest breathing, a look of sheer terror and agony on his face. And he sprung up and he started checking himself for what everybody else was checking for, which was obvious blood, obvious bones sticking out, broken bones. And much to his amazement, and much to the amazement of all the firefighters that were there really wasn't anything wrong with him. He had a few scrapes and abrasions, didn't break any bones, didn't do any major internal organ damage, and there was really, but for the fact that he had a good story, nothing wrong with him. And if the story ended there, you would have every right to think what I thought. Well, that's not much of a story. We've all heard folks that have had near-death experiences, and he didn't even turn out to have a near-death experience because he was perfectly fine. And then he told me the rest of the story. When he saw the back of that trailer coming, and he knew that there was a possibility that he was going to be decapitated, and time slowed down, and he's weighing his options. He's pumping the brakes. He's scanning around. He knows he's going to hit. He doesn't know what to do. He makes that decision. He throws himself down horizontally against that bucket seat only a mere split second before impact took the top of the cab off and put him in a metal cocoon. He lay down on the cattle prod, and the cattle prod discharged. Now, I didn't know this, and I wouldn't know this if he hadn't told the story. This hot shot, if you hold the trigger down, it doesn't dump 50,000 volts into you continuously. It dumps 50,000 volts for 3 or 4 or 5 seconds, and then it recycles for a couple of minutes. And then it dumps another 50,000 volts into you 3, 4, 5 seconds, then waits a few minutes. And it does that over and over. So this whole time he was inside this cocoon of this truck, somehow he was up against the cattle prod, and the trigger got held down. So all this screaming he would do every couple of minutes was having 50,000 volts dumped into him. And he couldn't do anything except wait for the next round to come. He kept trying to shift around, but he was too tightly packed in steel. He couldn't get it done. So for 20 minutes, he sat there and got 50,000 volts dumped into him. And the worst part is that the prongs of this were right up against his left testicle. So for 30 minutes or 20 minutes or 40 minutes, and hell, does it really matter at this point in time? He was laying there in that metal cocoon, waiting for the next round of 50,000 volts being dumped right into his ball sack, right into his left testicle. And that is why when they finally pulled that mangled truck free, he sprung out of that truck like a jack-in-the-box, with a face so white that bystanders probably thought it was someone who had looked at death's door and had barely not gone through, but in fact might have been a guy who had looked at death's door and wished he could just go through it to get it over with. Now, because I'm a sensitive coworker, I did ask him if he at least got some kind of superpower or bionic power from all that electricity, and he assures me that he did not. All he got was a story about the longest half hour of his life. Now, he tells the story much better than I do. In fact, anytime I see him, and it's been a while since I have seen him, but when I do see him, and we're around folks who haven't heard the story firsthand, I always let him tell it because he can tell it much better than I can with much more emotion. But in homage to a guy who went through something that none of us would want to have to go through, I figured this story deserves a video all on its own. It's not the worst guy's story in the planet. I'm sure somewhere somebody's had a worse story than his, but his is the worst story I've ever heard told firsthand from someone who experienced it. Now, when he tells the story, he does make it a point to brake failure that caused his big adventure. It was not his reckless driving. All right, if you made it this far, I appreciate you sticking around with me. The next video, I'll be back on schedule as a tour guide. And until then,